Beautiful. Okay, hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to OBI's Lunch and Learn, Introduction to Drug Regulation and the IND process. I'm Adrienne Klein. I'm the Programs and Community Specialist here at OBI. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad that you're here. If you could please just stay on mute throughout the program. Unless you have a question, you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself. Or you can also put your question in the chat and we will address those questions throughout the whole program. So you don't have to wait till the very end to get your questions answered. So please jump in, be involved, engage with us, and that will be great. So we also have here with us is our newest member of the OBI team, and that's Lisa Wernley Hunt. She is our new controller and financial operations specialist. And also with us is the executive director of OBI, Heather Ellis. So we're going to go ahead and put their LinkedIn links into the chat so you can connect with them. And also in there will be my LinkedIn so you can connect with us. And we love to connect with our community. So don't be shy, feel free to connect. Okay, so you'll also find in your chat a link to our land acknowledgement. So Otradi would like to acknowledge the land that we are all on, wherever we may be. Otradi conducts business throughout Portland and beyond and is making an effort to acknowledge the history of the area and work towards decolonization of the bioscience industry. So please take a moment to check that out and get educated on that. At the end of the program, before you leave Zoom, a little survey will pop up and it's anonymous, and I would love to get your feedback because this helps me know what kind of programs you want, what I can structure going forward. So, and it only takes just a couple minutes, so please fill that out. That would be amazing. All right, so with us today, please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Gordon, a regulatory affairs expert with 34 years of pharmaceutical and FDA experience. Specializing in drug and biologics development for rare diseases, her leadership roles span multiple companies, focusing on therapies from antifungals to gene-targeted treatments. She spent 6 years at the Food and Drug Administration, helping shape biological products, regulation policy across the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Lots of words there. And also I wanted to give a big shout out to our sponsor for our virtual growth series sponsor, Rain Catalyst. With us today is Jerry Bautista, the Capital Access Acceleration Manager. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so Jerry can share his.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrienne. Let me make sure I get the right one here. Here we go. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, it looks like there's some people in the waiting room.
I'm letting them in right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Thanks again for I just have a few things to share with you quickly. So Rain Catalyst is a nonprofit group with it's a virtual team that's spread across Oregon and Washington, so the entire Northwest. The goal is to help entrepreneurs get their businesses off the ground, to provide training and mentorship, and also foster a connection with various funding sources, whether those be equity funding through various angel groups, or it could be help with small business loans or other ways for these young businesses to get going. So we really, it's a team of about a dozen full-time people who are spread across various parts of Oregon and Washington. The goal is to make sure that the mentors are actually in the same places within the counties that the businesses are trying to grow. So it's all about that. And there's a very strong emphasis on women and minority-driven businesses as well. I know that's a little bit different these days in the broader politic, but it's very much in the central part of the charter of Rain Catalyst. I'm Jerry Batista. I was a long-term Intel employee, and we had to have a program called Intel Encore, where those who recently retired can take some of what they've learned over the years and apply them to nonprofits. And Intel gives a little bit of money to that nonprofit, and there's a small stipend that's given to me, and so that's how I got connected with Rain. And my goal is to help Rain in the training process. And I have a background of having been a native of Silicon Valley and grown up around startups. And I also drove the internal incubator in Intel for quite a number of years. So I have quite a bit of experience in helping and starting new things and getting them off the ground, particularly driving high technology into the marketplace. So this is Rain's charter and mission and vision. So I'm just scrolling through here quickly. Um, and we're very happy to help sponsor and participate in this lunch session. The other thing I was going to show you very quickly is the upcoming sessions that we have for our training for entrepreneurs, and essentially it's every other week a session around things like defining their value proposition, helping with business models, strategic pivots, getting investment pitch decks, putting that, and then putting the whole thing together. And we've got office hours between. The speakers are all very accomplished people who have been there, done that. University professors, people in industry, people who have created businesses and sold them. And the goal of this is to really help these entrepreneurs get off the ground with some really good, solid baseline understanding of what it takes to drive a business forward. Particularly when we know the average successful startup goes through three major strategic pivots before they have an exit. So when do you pivot? How do you pivot? Who stays after the pivot? Because sometimes the original people fall off. And so these are all things that we're working with these young companies to help. And in this session, we have in this spring session, this is our second time presenting this. We have about 35 teams and well over 50 people that are partaking in this. So anyway, I know this is brief, but that's what I had to share. So hopefully that was helpful and gives you a kind of a context for what Rain does.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jerry. We really appreciate the support that we get from Brain Catalyst. And it's great to collaborate with you guys. So next up, please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Gordon.
Can you see my screen? Perfect. Thank you. Well, let's get started, and feel free to interrupt with a question. I'm happy to entertain them as we're moving through. So. Today's presentation is going to highlight the history of drug regulation in the United States, an overview of the investigational new drug application, what's contained in that application, how you submit it, FDA's role in the review of the data that you submit, how you keep your IND healthy through amendments and updates and annual reports. And then there are other options for different types of INDs. And then what I would like to highlight, which kind of goes along with what Jerry talked about, is your strategy. I work with mostly young companies, and a lot of times their goals are to seek funding or to generate some positive data and allow a partner to take it to the finish line, just because they have a wealth of experience and a larger reach in their technical backgrounds. So what people can't forget is the role of your regulatory strategy person, your regulatory affairs department, understanding how you put together a plan to get from one point to another. And that involves generating a target product profile, or TPP, and communicating with the FDA. The FDA, having been an employee of the agency as a reviewer and a policy analyst, they are not your enemy. They really do try to be your partner. We may hear otherwise, but having been there, and they do try to foster development and be your partner in development. So I'm going to just focus on drugs and biological products. That's where my expertise lies. I can't speak to in vitro diagnostics or medical devices, and I know that we have some experts in the Portland area that can speak to that, and maybe we'll hear from them in the future. But I'll just concentrate on pharmaceutical products that are drugs or biologics. So the regulation of drug development and approval is governed by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And in that act, it defines that drugs are defined by their intended use. They are used for diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a disease. And they are articles other than food that are intended to impact the structure or function of the body in man and other animals. That is what is governing the regulation of drugs. Biologics, on the other hand, are governed by the Public Health Service Act, which defines a biological product as a virus, therapeutic serum, toxin, antitoxin, vaccine, blood component, or derivative, allergenic products, your allergy shots, proteins, or other analogous products. It also tucks in there arsphenamine or derivatives thereof. I know that when I was at FDA, hoping to better define the Public Health Service Act, we met with a lot of folks in General Counsel trying to understand how the arsphenamine products got listed in the Public Health Service Act as a biological product, and they could find no approved products or no reference to how that got there. And rather than take it out, they just left it. So interesting little background from our work here. And then proteins are defined as one that has a defined sequence that's greater than 40 amino acids. So essentially, biological products come from living cells. So what are the statutory requirements that govern the regulation of drugs and biologics? As I said prior, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act governs the regulation and development of drugs. And biologics are also considered drugs, but they have to speak to or address the Public Health Service Act, as well as some portions of the FD&C Act. And so when you read these laws, a lot of times people need further interpretation, and that's what our regulations do. And they interpret the law, the acts that are in the first couple of bullets. And we as regulators refer to these acts constantly. They're in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, and the parts that apply to drugs and biologics are 210, 211, 312, 314, as well as 600. And that's where people try to get an interpretation of what the FD&C Act and the PHS Act say. And then further, FDA issues guidance documents. They're called FDA Guidance for Industry documents, and you can find them on the FDA website. And we as regulators refer to them all the time because they are the FDA's current thinking on what the regulations mean and what we as developers need to keep in mind. These guidance documents are never finalized. They are constantly reviewed and changed if needed so that it can accommodate today's technology. So we as regulators are looking at all of these things, the laws, the acts, the regulations, as well as the guidance documents to do our work. So how did the FDA come about, and how did these laws come into place? Unfortunately, many of them were the result of tragedies in the United States. And the first being the first law that was put into place, and which was sort of the backbone for the FD&C Act, was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And what that required was strength and purity requirements for drugs, and it, sort of prevented misbranding. So if you think in terms of, the snake oil salesman with his cart and buggy trying to sell you an elixir, it was recognized that that is not a way to protect the health of the public. In 1938 was the start of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And again, that was a tragedy where an antibiotic, sulfanilamide, was contaminated with polyethylene glycol, and 107 individuals died as a result. So safety requirements were added to drugs. I mean, it's kind of scary to think that we were not paying attention to the safety of what's contained in our products at that time. There were pre-market approvals of the drugs, which meant that you had to apply to get them approved. And then it allowed the FDA to inspect facilities that were making drugs. Now, for those of us who were born before 1962, this is staggering. The Kefauver-Harris Acts finally added an efficacy requirement. So you had to prove that drugs were effective for their intended use. Prior to 1962, that was not required. Kind of scary, I think. We also added in the 1962 amendments good manufacturing practices for the way the drugs are manufactured, and the cleanliness, and tracking how we get our raw materials. We also put into law adverse reaction reporting and informed consent for people who were in clinical trials. In 1983, we added the Orphan Drug Act, which allowed for people to get, or developers to get, incentives to develop drugs for very rare diseases that impact less than 200,000 people in the United States. The prevalence is less than 200,000. Because they're not big money makers, and so we were the Orphan Drug Act allowed for market exclusivity and other tax benefits. The Federal Anti-Tampering Act also came in 1983. Recall that in 1982, extra strength Tylenol was tampered with and was laced with potassium cyanide, and that prompted this Anti-Tampering Act. In 1984, we finally got the opportunity to develop and sell generic drugs, and what that protection of generic drugs for the innovator allowed for additional patent protection that one can apply for. The 90s saw some labeling changes in education, and then in 1992, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act came into play. These last several were not based on any tragedy, and I was working at the FDA when we call it PDUFA came into play. And the United States is the only country that doesn't charge for the job that they did. So when you filed applications to Europe and Canada, there was a fee associated with them. And so what FDA was criticized for was how long it took to get a drug approved. So Congress approved PDUFA in 1992 that levied a user fee on people who were applying for approval for drugs in the United States, and that those user fees were in turn used to hire more personnel in hopes that we could get things reviewed and the comments could get back to the developers in a much more timely fashion. In turn, the FDA was held to certain timelines for reviewing documents, getting comments back, and working to get these drugs on the market if they were safe and effective as quickly as possible. In 97, the FDA Modernization Act was approved, and what it did was renewed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So we do have, we continue to charge companies for submission of applications for approval. And we also have included other milestones for interacting with the regulated industry to give them feedback in a more timely manner. And then finally, the 2016 21st Century Cures Act, which is kind of near and dear to my heart because I work in rare diseases, was trying to provide incentives and support to get drugs for rare diseases, for products that meet an unmet medical need, and help to get those on the market faster. People have heard about the Cancer Moonshot that falls under the 21st Century Cures Act. There's a lot. There are many more things that have sort of moved the FDA into our current times. And I think that we, for those of us who work in regulatory affairs, we're excited that minority populations are being recognized, the elderly, we're looking more at children and rare diseases, protection against bioterrorism. All of those things are being addressed by the agency through new laws. So how do we get a drug approved in the United States? The FD&C Act says that no one should introduce or deliver for introduction into interstate commerce a new drug unless that drug has been submitted in an application or is the subject of an application, and that application is reviewed and approved by the FDA. The mechanism for that is the new drug application, or the NDA. So that allows drugs that were approved to be shipped across the United States. The companion application for biologics is called the Biologics License Application. It's essentially an NDA, but the types of information that's submitted is a little bit different. So people ask all the time, well, I am looking at a investigational product that has not yet been approved, and I want to study it in clinical trials, and I'm manufacturing in California, for example, but I want to have clinical trial sites in New York or New Jersey. How do I get this drug to be introduced into interstate commerce for these clinical trials? And the way you do that is an investigational new drug application, or an IND. And that is essentially the application that's filed when you want to do a clinical trial with an unapproved drug in the United States, or a drug that's approved, but you're using it under outside of what is claimed on the label. So essentially, it's a notice of claimed exemption to the interstate commerce rule. And the IND is never approved or disapproved. It's allowed, or your studies under that IND are allowed to proceed unless you're placed on clinical hold by the FDA. So I spend a lot of time working with folks on how to get their INDs written and in place, and making sure that they are reviewed and the outcome is favorable, or the IND is allowed. So what is the purpose of an IND? Safety, safety, safety is the first thing, and that is reviewed by the FDA, because we're doing the studies to find out if the product is, or the molecule is safe, and eventually whether or not it's effective for its intended use. To initiate a clinical trial or to support an IND, the types of information that's included is a chemistry, manufacturing, and controls section, or CMC. What is the drug? How is it made? Who are your manufacturers? How is it tested while it's being made? How is it tested when it's released? How do you ship it to a drug product manufacturer if you don't have that one in the same place? That means putting it in a syringe or a bottle or a tablet or a capsule. And FDA needs to know how all of that is happening in the CMC section. The pharmacology is essentially the mechanism of action, some early animal studies, some in vitro studies. How does your drug work? What is the PK profile in animals? And more importantly, what is the tox or safety profile look like for the intended use of a clinical trial? So if the trial that you're first doing is a single dose administration of a product, you only really have to do a single dose tox study. No one does that because it costs a lot of money, but the FDA looks to make sure that you're covering the duration of use in your tox studies based on what you're doing in the clinic. Any previous human experience or marketing data outside of the US, and then other relevant forms. And one of those forms is a clinicaltrials.gov requirement. And I think a lot of us who are in drug development, we often check on our competitors and check out what's out there by looking at clinicaltrials.gov. And it's required to be submitted with an IND. A lot of journals now are requiring that you have a clinicaltrials.gov listing or a number before they will accept your study results. So this was put into place when I was at the FDA, just to be sure that the general public knew what was available to them. A lot of times, if you're not near a research center or the doctors that you're going to are not participating in a trial, you may not know for your particular cancer whether or not there's a trial available when there might not be any other therapeutic alternatives. And clinicaltrials.gov was intended for mostly patients to find out what's available to them. So the phases of clinical study, and I'll just briefly go over this. There are actually four phases. The first one, phase one, is usually your initial introduction into humans. There are multiple doses that are tested, and this is the first exposure. So these studies are closely monitored, and the goal is to understand the safety and the pharmacokinetics of the drug. And we usually do these studies in very small populations, sometimes as small as 25 or maybe 50, but it could be as small as 10. And so these studies are done in healthy subjects unless it's not ethical to do it in healthy subjects. In other words, if the drug has some associated toxicities like a chemotherapeutic, you're not going to introduce those toxicities or negative effects in healthy volunteers. The FDA will allow you to do that phase one study in the intended population or patients. Phase two studies are generally well controlled. They might have a standard of care as your control arm or a placebo if it's ethical. We start to look at efficacy endpoints in this in phase two, and we sort of are setting the stage for our confirmatory efficacy studies in phase two. What biomarkers, what markers work, what is the best way to assess activity of the drug? Again, small numbers, usually in the hundreds, and we're trying to optimize the dose, the route of administration, the dose regimen, the patient population, during phase 2. And then phase 3 are our pivotal efficacy studies. They can be, depending on the prevalence of the population in the US, can be as small as in the hundreds or less than 100 if it's a very rare disease, or the thousands. So antibiotics for otitis media in children, those trials can be 5,000 patients. So it just depends on what your intended use is and what you're hoping your label will say at the end of the day. So what happens to the IND when you file it? FDA receives it electronically. All INDs from commercial sponsors are required to be electronic, and they're in a specific format called the Common Technical Document. And you get assigned a number if you haven't already gotten one, and a date stamp, because the FDA needs to review the IND application within 30 days of receipt. So that date stamp is really important. If you are a physician sponsor or a research sponsor, investigator sponsor, you can still file paper INDs, but FDA much prefers an electronic IND, but those again can be pretty pricey to put together. You at the same time, you are assigned a project manager who is your point person at the FDA. That person responds to emails and phone calls. A lot of these project managers are working remotely, or at least they were. And so a lot of times don't expect to call FDA and someone's going to pick up. So we set up secure secure email with our project manager and FDA so that we have an actual communication opportunity or a contact point at the agency. I don't know if you can see this very well. It's very small on my screen, but essentially the process is this as depicted in this schematic. The applicant or the drug sponsor, the drug company, submits an IND, and it's reviewed by the Center for Drugs or the Center for Biologics, and the IND is broken up into different parts. So a medical reviewer only reviews the medical, the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls folks review just that one section, the pharmacology, toxicology, and then stats if it's applicable. The first review is for safety. Always safety, safety, safety for an IND. If it's deemed to be safe, a safe product based on the data that has been submitted, the reviews are completed, and it's acceptable. There's no deficiencies, and your study, your IND will be activated, or your studies may proceed. If the FDA has some questions, they can send you some, we call them non-hold comments, and we try to answer those questions pretty quickly. But in the event that the agency finds that there is a safety concern or safety questions, they can place your IND on clinical hold. They rapidly notify you, usually by phone, that your studies may not proceed and you are on clinical hold. And within 30 days of that clinical hold decision, you will get a letter that identifies every clinical hold issue, whether if it's 1 or if it's 50. You will get all of them within 30 days so that you know where you stand. So I said that the review is 30 days. The IND or the study will become active 30 days after receipt if the hold is not imposed. A lot of times FDA asks for a telephone conference call on the day 28 or 29 to discuss any potential issues that you might have, what might lead to a clinical hold, because FDA, it's more work for FDA to put you on clinical hold. And if they can get you to commit to fix something over the phone, and then you just do it in writing through email, they will allow the study to proceed pending the corrections that you would submit as an amendment to your IND. They really do try to work with you so that you can get a study off the ground. If it can't be resolved quickly, FDA discusses with you that you will be placed on clinical hold, and they give you a general idea of what is required of you or what the issues are, and then within 30 days, they'll follow up with a formal letter. This hold means that none of the studies under that IND can proceed. Patients can't be dosed. If you have patients that are already receiving the drug under maybe another IND or another protocol within an IND, FDA can stop those trials as well. They'll let you know the scope of the clinical hold. This is a serious infraction, and there's ways to avoid clinical holds, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then I've reserved some of that for session 2 on FDA meetings and communications with the FDA. But within 30 days of the phone call that puts you on clinical hold, FDA will send you a full accounting of every item that needs to be addressed. And FDA will not review your complete response to clinical hold unless you address all of them. You can't address items 1 and 2 and forget about, 47 to 50. They will not start the review until you have responded to every clinical hold item. There are other INDs, not just the ones that you do for new products. A lot of investigators or researchers might do a research IND where they might be looking at an already approved drug for a different indication or a different use. These are often done by universities and looking to provide information to physicians about the way people respond to drugs when they're used sort of off-label. There are treatment INDs or treatment protocols. Usually those are filed after you have already demonstrated safety and effectiveness with a new product, and the product is heading towards a new drug application, but it has shown such benefit in a given population that you're going to try to open up this therapeutic to patients of need. So we do that under a treatment IND. And then finally, there's an expanded access program. We know it as an emergency IND or a compassionate use IND, where individuals or small groups of patients need to get an unapproved drug or an investigational drug for a serious and life-threatening condition. And FDA, I worked on an antifungal program for serious fungal infections, and we had dozens and dozens of patients who had experienced drug resistance to the current therapeutics and were in ICUs and were going to die. And we had compassionate use protocols that were approved by the FDA at midnight, at 2 a.m, on weekends. And they really were our partner in this effort to save the life of patients who had no longer any options for their infection. So FDA is very keen to work with you on these expanded access and compassionate use programs. As I mentioned earlier, things that we, when you start to put together your team to develop a new product, some people think of regulatory too late, but there's so much that regulatory affairs contributes to the overall product development timeline and how we get from point A to point B. But for drugs, we often look at the end. What do we want our package insert to say? What population should receive this drug? What kind of safety do we expect? What kind of efficacy or endpoints should we be looking at? And we sort of work backwards and say, well, what clinical trials then would I need to do in order to get that ideal target product profile or package insert? And every step along the way, there are ways to interact with FDA and explain to them what they're doing and look for their partnership. And also, and I'll talk about this in session 3, there's a lot of different programs that FDA has available to expedite drug development and help with rare disease drug development. And that is something that I'll talk about in session 3. This TPP is not something that I share with FDA, at least not early on with my new clients, but it's something that companies tend to keep in-house, update in-house, and it often drives our development program. In session 2, I'm going to talk a lot about FDA communications and how we interact with FDA. You know, you can't just pick up the phone all the time and expect to get some advice from FDA, but we can hear from FDA through written correspondence, email. Those are all considered official now. Phone calls, video calls, face-to-face meetings, and these meetings are your avenue to sort of get a pulse check on how FDA feels about the data that you have, where you're headed, and they will provide some feedback on where you're going and thoughts on your development program. These meetings are free, and people should take advantage of them. They're not easy to get, and there's certain requirements of how you schedule them, when you schedule them, when you send in the information, and that is something that we'll talk about in session 2. There are meetings throughout the phases of development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and each of these meetings have different purposes. But sponsors are most concerned with what do I do next? How do you feel about this pathway? Would FDA have any issues with it? And that's what these meetings allow you to do. I'm going to just go to the next slide because I love this schematic. So the little diamonds, the yellow diamonds, are the meetings that you can have with the FDA. We usually have all the way to the left. The first diamond is usually your pre-IND meeting. We have it before we submit an IND and before we start clinical testing with our product. And then we often have a meeting, we submit our IND and then we'll start our trial. And then we often have a meeting during the phase 2, pre-phase 3 time. And we'll often have another meeting just before the NDA is submitted. And you might even have a meeting during the review period. And all of these arrows have a regulatory component, and there's a timeline that's associated with having these interactions and are important in your drug development pathway.
Elizabeth, I have a question.
Yeah.
From the audience. please touch upon what it takes to transfer/convert an investigator IND to a commercial IND.
Sure. You have to have a commercial sponsor, a company, and the level of information shouldn't be any different. You still have to demonstrate the safety of a product, and the sections are kind of the same, but once you have a new sponsor, it's a new IND to keep things clean. That doesn't mean that your investigator sponsor IND goes away and all the data and interactions that you had with FDA goes away. You can cross-reference that IND or allow the FDA to reference it in behalf of the new commercial IND. But to keep things clean, I don't convert INDs. It's a brand new number, so it's a new IND. Any other questions?
That's all we have so far.
Okay. So I think in summary, the regulatory program is a collaboration between all the technical disciplines, your clinical, your manufacturing and controls, non-clinical and regulatory affairs. That's your team. Your non-clinical includes pharmacologists. They include ADME specialists, PK specialists, toxicologists, and there's a large team that is contributing, and it doesn't have to always be employees. I mean, I've worked in companies that have less than 20 people, and we use consultants quite effectively. We don't all have to be Pfizer and Merck in order to enter a clinical trial and study a new molecule. FDA is your partner in development. And I don't just say that because I'm a former FDA employee and former reviewer. I have found that since I left the agency, which was in 1996, I have only had positive experiences. I don't always agree with the outcome, but I understand where they're coming from, and I understand why certain things need to be fixed and data needs to be presented properly. The regulatory effort is driven by, your overall program. And so looking at your package insert at the end of the day, and then how you want to get there, the involvement of each of these technical areas, as well as regulatory affairs, is crucial to your success.
Okay, we had a new question come in.
Yep.
They say, you mentioned rare diseases. Is the IND for them different? If so, how? Do you have any tips?
No, it's no different. It is the same IND that you file for an antibiotic or any other blood pressure medication. I think that sometimes the content of the IND is the same. And you can apply for incentives that FDA has offered for rare diseases that allow things to be looked at quickly, for example. So, for example, if you are working on an orphan indication, so a disease that impacts less than 200,000 people in the United States, you can apply for that orphan product designation before you even file an IND. And a lot of times, if you request, someone from the orphan drug office will attend your pre-IND meeting, and the Office of Orphan Products is under the commissioner's office. So when somebody from the commissioner's office walks into your pre-IND meeting, I think that reviewers sit a little taller and they give you a little more attention. but it's essentially the same. The clinical trials tend to be smaller. So for example, if you have a rare disease that only impacts 2,000 patients in the United States, your pivotal trials, depending on the statistics and your endpoints, might only be 80 patients. Any other questions?
There might be 1 second. Oh, yes, there is. What are some considerations that you think is important when transferring IND from a small startup to a larger biotech?
Well, I think that, maybe our colleague, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, can also speak to this, but these larger commercial sponsors will review your data very carefully when you partner with them, and if you have an IND that's a physician sponsored or a research sponsored IND and FDA has already seen it, and there's nothing adverse associated with it, they didn't send you a letter, telling you all these additional things that needed to be done. I mean, your commercial sponsor is going to look at that and be your partner in that. Now, if you're a physician sponsor and you are starting a company yourself, I think maybe that might be where you might be going with this question. Again, you would file a new IND and reference everything that was done under the physician sponsor. It's not, nothing is looked at negatively when you move from an investigator sponsor, a research sponsor, to a commercial sponsor.
Okay, I have another question here. Can you talk about what is required in terms of manufacturing / CMC at different phases? How much work is required to change the manufacturing at later stages? On the one hand, I hear about phase appropriate development. On the other, I hear about it's hard to change a process.
So phase appropriate manufacture is a real term. So when I think of GMP, and full compliance with good manufacturing practices, to me, that means I can make the drug. I can make 3 full-scale commercial size lots 3 times in a row, and it's identical and passes all of its tests. No one is going to do that in phase 1. However, they are going to have appropriate checks and controls to make sure that the vendors who supply the raw materials have been qualified. The place where we manufacture is not somebody's bathtub. It's actually and I say that because I got a vaccine that was manufactured in a bathtub in someone's garage to review. It has clean water. It has an air handling system that prevents, the contaminated air from coming in. You have proper pressure differentials. So, you can do early manufacture in phase 1, and you can do development lots, and you work with your manufacturer to test and control and make sure that you're getting something that can be made again. And that's what you're doing early on. I think that people have to be careful that when they change manufacturing, and I'm not saying you can't, you might need to do another small clinical trial or an animal study to show that the drug is the same or it behaves the same. It just depends on what the change is. I mean, if you're merely scaling up, make it different size, You don't typically have to do a whole lot of studies, but you just do your typical release studies and in-process studies. I don't think it's as hard as people say it is. I mean, it's frightening, but we work with contract manufacturers that know how to do this. And we work with formulation development experts who know how to make these changes and how to test these drugs. It's not as frightening as people think it is, but when you make significant changes and substantial changes, you definitely could be responsible for doing a small animal study or a small clinical study. I will tell you that large pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck, they never make a manufacturing change unless they test it in the clinic or in animals, because they have deep pockets and they can do that. Small folks can't do that.
So we have time for 2 more questions. This question is, I realize that diagnostics are a different class from drugs, but is there a typical patient sample size that is needed for FDA clearance?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, so next question is, can you speak to or point to where I can find the requirements for an ADME study versus a PK study?
There are guidance documents on PK requirements that you can find on the FDA website, and it's usually, by drug class. There's a section, if you just go on to fda.gov and search, go to the Center for Drugs or Biologics and then search PK studies or ADME studies.
Okay, one more, because there's a follow-up question to the previous one about phase appropriate development. So it's pretty helpful. Can you give me an example of changes that would not require an additional study?
Well, scale changes, size changes. Maybe you might get a raw material or one other component from a different manufacturer that you qualified. Depending on how your batch records are written and your testing is written, sometimes even changing manufacturing facilities may not require another clinical study. It just depends on what your change is.
Okay, well, wonderful. I think that kind of wraps it up here. I want to say thank you to everyone for outstanding discussion. Special thanks to Dr. Elizabeth Gordon for her valuable insights and experiences. Also, big thanks to Rain Catalyst for sponsoring this event. Keep in mind, this is just the first of 3 in a series. So Elizabeth will be coming back to us and we will be doing more on this. So keep an eye out for the emails that you get from me. And also Lisa's going to put a link in the chat for our events calendar so you can find out what's coming up next. Also, don't forget that there will be a survey that pops up at the end here. Please take the moment to fill it out. That would be really helpful to me. And we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.